So what's up people and welcome to the chapter 25 discussion of Choujin X. So typically I would do two chapters, chapter 25 and 26, and both chapters have already come out. But while I was making the video, I realized that after looking at the contents for chapter 25, there was so much content to go over. And since chapter 26 and 25 were so different, I decided to make a separate video for 25 and will make another video for 26 later on. Now, chapter 26 came out in two parts, 26.1 and 26.2. And since Manga Plus, the publisher's official website, provides these chapters for free for 3-chapter sets, once 27 comes out, chapter 25 will disappear. So if you're interested in reading chapter 25, I would suggest for you to do so very quickly because since Sui Ishida randomly brings out these chapters, we never know when 27 will come out, and once it does, we will no longer be able to read chapter 25 again. So I will leave a link to this chapter in the description section of this video, and if you're interested and if it's still available, try the link and see if it's there. Okay, so chapter 25 was quite the chapter. And it follows a very big chapter of 24, where I mentioned in my previous discussion that I thought chapter 24 was the closing of the first part of the series, because it is finally in chapter 24 where we find out what the meaning of Choujin X means, and that opens up the story for the future. But chapter 25 is kind of like a cleanup chapter, and it goes over many things. And the reason why I think now chapter 25 is the ending of the first part is because of how this chapter ends. And I'll go over that later on. But there is a lot of content to cover. So let me start with the first one, which is a very important point. And it's very Sui Ishida-like in storytelling. But it's also quite worrying. And the first part is a backstory, and we go back to the country of Gaga, and it talks about one family of a father, mother, and a daughter. And it turns out that the daughter is a Choujin, and from what it sounds like, a very powerful one, and she starts rebelling. So much so that she creates a gang, and this gang almost becomes like a terrorist group and wreaks havoc in the world. She becomes infamous in her standing, and the parents wonder what they did wrong to raise her that way. But eventually, the daughter comes back, according to the backstory. She is almost at death's door, and she brings her daughter, her newly born daughter, to her parents and begs them to raise her in a manner that will prevent the daughter from becoming like herself. And with that last request, she finally passes on, and the grandparents do decide to raise their granddaughter. And this granddaughter eventually grows up and finds out about the history of her mother, and she vows that she will never ever follow in her mother's footsteps and will find a way to lead a more productive life. But what is very worrisome is during that final part of the backstory, they mention that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, and there are voices in the daughter's head that start speaking to her and telling her that she will actually follow in the footsteps of her mother. And what is so worrisome about this backstory is the daughter turns out to be Ellie. So this is a very big surprise because from my perspective, I feel that Ellie was the most stable and the most positive of all the characters that have come out as rookie Choujins. Of the three, Tokyo, Azuma, and Ellie, it felt like Ellie had everything together the most. And so she was always the anchor of this story, and we could always rely on her as being able to be there as support, as well as being a positive character throughout the story. I really liked Ellie because of that positivity. But just like Sui Ishida did in Tokyo Ghoul, he has the ability to dig deeper into a person's psyche. And one of the things that we find out about Sui Ishida's writing style is that he never really creates characters in terms of a perfectly good or a perfectly evil, but is a combination of very complex psyche. And so now we're starting to realize that Ellie has a really dark side, and the concern is how this dark side will start growing and potentially affecting her personality. And because of this persona, Ellie becomes a somewhat bigger character in this story. Up till now, Ellie was very much a support character. We really liked her and we relied on her support, and she was very impactful to the story, but she did feel like a support character, with the majority of the story revolving around Tokyo and a little bit around Asuma. But now, with this complexity and this character development, we see that Ellie will potentially grow as this keeps on going. And the worry, once again, is that she may grow into a character that may be less appealing in the future, but can give a tremendous amount of plot. In other words, will Ellie become an antagonist? And that's something that we don't know yet, but Sui Ishida never drops these sorts of hints without having a consequence in the future. So by itself, this part of the story, yet again, closes the first part of the story by setting Ellie up as a much more complex character to watch over in the future part of the story. And as we continue down, there are additional different parts of the story. One part is with regards to Ririka and Ricardo. If you remember the two mercenary Choujins that tried to kidnap Tokyo, and what triggered that entire Asuma incident a few chapters back. And we weren't sure exactly what happened to them because after Asuma ripping them apart, he got so focused in battling Tokyo that we never really knew what happened to them. Well, now we understand that Ricardo was able to take the opportunity of Asuma fighting Tokyo to somehow take Ririka and get away from that area. And they are both alive. And we find out that the person who was hiring them was the Choujin that was distributing the serums in the very first part of the story. And we find out that that character is named the pharmacist. Now we have a name. And he was the one that hired Ririka and Ricardo for this task. And it seems like Ririka and Ricardo are somewhat contracted to this pharmacist to do multiple tasks and dirty work whenever necessary. So the question is how is this character connected to the other evil character, which is the Smoke Choujin? And we find out that there is a connection. We're not really sure how close a connection because through the phone discussion and the question that the Smoke Choujin asks, which is how did you get my phone number? It almost feels like there is not a really strong relationship between the pharmacist and the Smoke Choujin, which is very weird because if you remember, when that mysterious, really powerful Choujin mentioned that the bird Choujin has awakened, he was talking to the Smoke Choujin. And yet the awakening happened because Tokyo took the serum. And the serum was delivered by the pharmacist. So was the really powerful, mysterious Choujin also working with the pharmacist? And if they are all working together, how come there is a little bit of a distance that you see between the pharmacist and that Smoke Choujin? I don't know. But they don't seem to be complete strangers. And in fact, once the pharmacist gets the debriefing from Ririka and Ricardo on what just happened, he gives that information to the Smoke Choujin. And the Smoke Choujin gets really excited, and they seem to be planning the next course of action, which indicates that Tokyo will encounter these characters sometime in the future. And now, with regards to Tokyo, aside from this problematic backstory revolving Ellie, the other concerning part of the story involves a dream that Tokyo has. And this dream includes a devastated part of city Tokyo and an airline that has crashed into the ground once again. If you recall, that's how Ellie received her Choujin powers when it triggered during that accident. And what's interesting is the way the aircraft seems to be on the ground, there seems to be a lot of smoke and fire billowing away. Now, that would be typical of any accident where an airplane would crash into the ground. But the question is that exemplified due to something that Ellie did to make the airplane come down? We're not sure. But considering that we got in the same chapter that Ellie is potentially going to the dark side, and then we get this image of this wrecked aircraft with a lot of smoke all around it, it does ask that question. But we're not given a chance to dwell upon it too much because since this is Tokyo's dream, we see Tokyo looking at this landscape, and right near him is Azuma in his transformed form. In fact, it's in a form beyond his current transformed form in that there are these really weird eyes attached to his head. And the interesting thing that Azuma tells Tokyo is that whatever happened in this image was all Tokyo's fault. So was Tokyo the person who committed this accident? Or was Tokyo the person that triggered an incident that caused somebody else to commit that accident? We're not sure. And considering the fact that Azuma is looking very strange, very, very strange, was it Azuma who committed that accident and then is blaming Tokyo once again for being the trigger for that? Did he do something to Azuma that enraged Azuma and created that accident? So any one of these three characters can potentially be the cause for that accident that we see in the stream. And what's interesting is later on in this chapter, we see Tokyo and Azuma together. In fact, this starts with Tokyo and Ellie together. And the funny thing we find out is that as competent a character as Ellie is as a Choujin, she is doing terrible in school. All her grades she is failing, and she finds out that she has to do makeup classes during the summer vacation. And that is driving her crazy. And so she asks Tokyo whether he could help her study. And Tokyo tells her that he just barely passed, and so he's not the right person to help her study. And they go through a lot of this comical discussion. And at that time, Azuma arrives. And considering that the last time Ellie saw Azuma was in his Choujin form stabbing Ellie to death, Ellie is not in a mood to actually greet Azuma positively. But the reason Azuma arrived is because he did want to take responsibility for their last encounter, and he wanted to apologize to Ellie. And so it turns out that they will decide to make amends, and they do apologize and accept each other's friendship. And this, of course, is helped by Tokyo the wingman, who keeps on whispering into Ellie's ear that Azuma is one of the top students in the school, and he will be the perfect person to help her study if she is willing to make amends with him. So everything goes well, and this leaves Tokyo and Azuma alone walking home. And Azuma thanks Tokyo for many of the things that happened, and then he talks about the conversation he had with Sandek, where he tells Tokyo that Sandek mentioned that Azuma was out of control. And now, of course, we go into Azuma's dialogue where he goes into his worry about whether he will ever be able to gain control again. And at that point, we find a really surprising moment because we find out that Azuma had the same dream that Tokyo had with regards to the image of the wrecked airplane. But in his dream, he encountered, of course, Tokyo in his Choujin form. And it was Tokyo who told Azuma that it was all his fault. So what does that mean, where both parties have the same dream, but the one conflicting thing within the dream is that both of them are told by the other that it's their fault? So what does this all mean? This is very interesting. It opens up a question which I cannot answer, but it does open up a very interesting point. With this, we are really bringing a situation where either Tokyo or Azuma may become more antagonistic. But at the same time, that backstory that we found from Ellie also indicates that she may also become an antagonist. So who is potentially the bad guy? Is it all these other Choujins that we know are in the other faction, such as that mysterious all-powerful one? Or will one of these characters turn and become a major antagonist to the other two? It's really interesting the way Sui Ishida has set this up, and that's why I say this is really more the closing of the first part, because it sets up this big question with regards to the potential dark side that all three characters have, and the worry that one of them may actually fall towards that dark side within them. But that's something for the future. And I love the way this story ends because it has one of the best Nakama scenes that I have read in a long time. Azuma, who is seriously worried that he is going to go out of control, asks Tokyo to kill him if he ever does that again. And Tokyo refuses and says, I will not kill you, but I will beat the crap out of you so that you will stop becoming a menace, and then I will do everything in my power to save you. And at that point, Tokyo says, to be able to make sure we can be there for each other, please join the Yamato Mori and become a future keeper. And the chapter ends with the two agreeing to help each other. And why I say this is such a nice Nakama power scene is that this sort of relationship makes it a lot more realistic rather than these weird Nakama situations that create these really cliche and really hard to believe sorts of situations. And so I really like Sui Ishida's writing style here because it really shows the friendship and something that you could actually relate to. And because those two have decided to join the Yamato Mori and move forward to help each other, it really does help close this beginning part of the story with this chapter. And so that's why I mentioned that chapter 25 and chapter 26 are very distinct, because chapter 26, of course, opens up the next part of the story, and it's really hard to go over the review of that in the same video as chapter 25, which is ending the previous part. And so chapter 25 is a very impactful chapter, and it really does open up some interesting twists with regards to what we may see in the future. So I am looking forward to seeing how this comes out, and I will bring out the video for chapter 26 soon, and I hope you join me at that time. But thank you very much for listening to the chapter 25 discussion. What you think of it? Any comments that you can leave, I would appreciate. And until the next video, happy manga reading, and as always, Jaya, nice day everyone.